So for our next panel, we'll talk about free and fair elections, reforming for public trust. Hi, I'm Elaine Stephen, Partnerships Chair for Principles First. The rule of law we just discussed depends on leaders chosen by consent of the governed. Our next panel turns to the integrity and security of the elections through which that consent is expressed. How do we ensure election results reflect voters' intent and that the process remains fair and lawful from start to finish? Amit Agarwal is an expert on the Constitution and rule of law. He has clerked for SCOTUS and written amicus briefs for such cases as Trump v. Slaughter on protecting independent agencies. Michael McNulty, Policy Director at Issue 1, has worked to protect democracy and promote free and fair elections, both in the United States and abroad. Here in D.C., Lisa D.T. Rice led a successful ballot initiative establishing ranked choice voting in semi-open primaries, which passed with 73% of the vote, despite strong opposition from the local established politicians and partisan groups. The discussion will be moderated by Principles First volunteer Rory Riley Topping, an attorney and author whose forthcoming book on partisan gerrymandering and its impact on American democracy comes out this fall.
All right, thank you, Elaine. And thank you all for being here. You know, I was going to start with just a quick analogy. The Winter Olympics are going on right now, and we all think of Olympics as something that happens once every 4 years. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who think of elections the same way. They think it's something that they just show up for once every 4 years when there's a presidential election. And unfortunately, when you treat elections that way, that is when we have issues with things such as election integrity and security. When people aren't participating, when they aren't paying attention, that's a lot of times when our problems arise. So the Olympics are not the only things dominating the headlines right now. There's a lot of things related to election integrity and security that are dominating the headlines. We had a recent raid in Fulton County. There's been lots of talk about what we could see with the midterms. There's been some troubling rhetoric coming out of the administration with regard to fraud. There are the mid-decade gerrymandering wars continuing to rage on. There's talk of ICE potentially being stationed at polling places. So I'd like to hear from each of you, if you could maybe pick one or two of those topics that you have some knowledge about. I think a lot of people have been engaged with the headlines, don't really know what to be concerned about, what they can do. So can I start with you, Michael, and we'll just go down. What can you tell people about what we're seeing in the headlines?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to Principles First for having us here to talk about these important issues. I guess I'll pick the FBI raid of Fulton County. I think that one really fits into a larger pattern that we'll talk about, I think, on this panel. This raid on the Fulton County election office does raise quite significant concerns for those watching elections. Essentially, the FBI came in, did get a warrant, came in and took out many ballot boxes and other sensitive election materials from the Fulton County election office for an election that happened more than 5 years ago and was litigated, audited, and relitigated and re-audited multiple times. Some call this the most litigated election in the history of the United States. So there is concern when we have an executive branch and the FBI coming in and taking the ballots for a lot of reasons. One, there's something called the chain of custody in elections, and that means that sensitive materials, the ballots, and other related sensitive materials must be protected, and anybody who's accessing those materials needs to be part of the chain of custody and documented. And so what happened is the chain of custody is broken now, and we don't really know what's happening with those ballots, and the Fulton County election office is very concerned about that. I think another one is the issue of the Fourth Amendment. Probable cause, we saw the warrant was unsealed, and it appears from all the analysis that the probable cause in the warrant was based on long debunked conspiracy theories about what happened in Fulton County. And so the question here is, are we ensuring the Fourth Amendment? Are we ensuring probable cause is really based on? And we saw in the warrant that it was essentially driven by information by an election denier who's in the current executive branch. The other question is, when are elections final in our country? I've worked abroad and internationally, and one of the crucial things is the peaceful transition of power, and elections are final when they've been adjudicated, when the electoral dispute resolution process has been played out, and it was in Georgia multiple times. So that is a final decision, and 5.5 years later, we can't be relitigating and opening it up again. So I think the bigger concern here, though, is beyond Fulton County, right? What's precedent is this setting, both for the current administration and future maybe Democratic president administrations, when if the FBI can be weaponized to go back and look into elections from 5.5 years later, bringing up conspiracy theories, this is not something we want to see play out in politics in the United States. And thinking about it in terms of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 4 gives Congress and the states, and particularly the states, the right to run elections. And what we have here is an executive branch that's overstepping those bounds. And fortunately, what we've seen in the past few weeks is after the comment by the president to nationalize elections and that states are just an agent of the federal government, we've seen actually Republicans, brave Republicans on the Hill stand up and say, no, that's not what the Constitution says. So we've been very encouraged by some of the actions by Congress, and including Republicans on the Hill, who are saying, we don't want to see more of this. And so I think that is the crucial thing going forward that gives me hope that the brave election officials across the country and politicians on the Hill who need to do more are starting to stand up and say, we don't want to see more raids. We don't want to see Maricopa County and Detroit and other cities' election boards raided like it was in Fulton County. So very hopeful based on that, and I want to see more, hopefully.
We're going to go over to Lisa. What from the headlines has caught your attention?
Yeah, and thank you again for inviting me. In the last 2 months, we've seen across the country and the District of Columbia, the Department of Justice coming in and asking for voter data. And I am so proud to be a resident of the District of Columbia, where our executive director of the Board of Elections said, sure, you can have what's publicly available. So, and she provided that information, but she refused to provide voter-specific data. So no social security numbers, no date of birth, that kind of thing. And that's the wonderful thing about our Board of Elections. We have an independent agency that stands up to the Department of Justice, that also stands up to our council, because sometimes our city council wants to manipulate, pressure some decisions with ballot initiatives, and we'll talk about that later. But it was really, we want some good news right now. We want some good news. And so I really felt good when I read that the district was one of the places that said, you may have what's publicly available and no more. And that was really good, and I feel really good about that.
And Amit, what's been, from the headlines, had your attention that you're concerned about?
Yeah, I would say the thing that's most on my mind is the dissemination of disinformation, including about an alleged epidemic of non-citizen voting. More generally, just kind of the dissemination of disinformation and the idea that there are not shared facts and shared reality that we have. And to the extent that we have reasonable disagreements about factual issues, do we have an agreed upon process by which we can resolve those disagreements? And so, that brings to mind the thing that's really been most on my mind the last couple of days is an issue that doesn't directly deal with elections, but I think it has everything to do with elections in a wider sense, and that is the tariff decision that came out of the Supreme Court and the administration's response to it. And that is to say, you have a disagreement about questions, in that case, questions of law, reasonable disagreements perhaps, but we have a process that has been in place in this country for hundreds of years, ever since Marbury v. Madison, where the Supreme Court said it is emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. That's the role of the Supreme Court. And the court comes out with a decision, and instead of honoring and respecting it, we see not just a ventilation of respectful disagreement, but an assault, an open assault on the court, on the integrity of the justices. And that, I think, is profoundly concerning and could potentially have very dangerous implications, not just for the rule of law, but in particular in the context of election administration.
Thank you. So I think we want to zoom out a little bit For those of you that were here yesterday, you heard the opening remarks from our founder, Heath Mayo, and he made reference to the fact that there are some systemic issues with our nation's election system, our branches of government. So in terms of systemic reform, Michael, I'm going to take this one to you. What issues do we have on the systemic level? Because until we fix the system, if you keep putting different people in, it's a process problem, it's not a people problem. How can we fix election systems? We've seen there are loopholes that are being exploited. What jumps out at you as issues that impact integrity and security just on the big picture level?
Well, thanks. Good question. I would first start out, so I used to work in the international democracy space and did a lot of international election observation. And so I would take that lens and just say, like, all right, break down the components of the US election system. We actually have a lot of strengths. Our election administration is very strong. It is decentralized. We have brave election officials at every level who are fighting the fight to defend and carry out elections effectively despite harassment, intimidation, and what we've seen a lot of turnover in the last few years due to some of that. So our election administration is an absolute strength, and they've proven that in recent election cycles. Another strength is our courts. Our election dispute resolution processes are strong and have proven resilient against cases that may be spurious. And then we have space for genuine competition, political competition. So we should acknowledge the good things first. But like you said, there's significant structural problems. We have, gerrymandered House districts. I think it's something like 9 out of 10 almost are uncompetitive. We have an electoral college that unfortunately distorts the vote a bit. We have closed primaries. I know you've worked on open primaries. We have a lot of things that skew representation and concentrate power and create incentives for polarization. So there's structural things there. Campaign finance, money in politics is a big problem. We don't have time to talk about that details. Voter access and participation, there are still some challenges with barriers. Again, working internationally, it is extremely disappointing to see the turnout that we have in the US. 40% during midterms, maybe up to 60% during presidential years. That is abysmal compared to other democracies around the world. And then I would say the information environment, as Amit said, is another concern. So solutions, we could, there's no silver bullet. Structural reforms are crucial. I would argue that ending gerrymandering is a really crucial reform, and there's three specific federal level legislation bills that could be done by Congress to change that are very clearly a bipartisan issue to change. I think strengthening Article 1, Section 4, the Elections Clause. We have a playbook called We the People Playbook, and one of those points is let's strengthen Article 1, Section 4, which says the states have a right to run elections and only Congress and not the executive branch. So there's some specific guardrails that could be added to that to protect against some of the executive overreach that we're seeing now and might see in the future by Democratic presidents, to be honest. And then I think the information environment, I won't repeat what Amit said, but we need much more robust voter education. We need much more robust civic engagement efforts. We need much more robust pre-bunking of false election narratives, not waiting to debunk after the fact, which we know is not effective. So I would put those three categories as sort of top priority. And then, of course, money and politics reform, but we're not going to get into that as much as we'd like.
We could have a whole other panel about that. That's a topic for another day. Lisa, you and I are both lovers of ballot initiatives. So I want to unpack ballot initiatives a little bit more, maybe for people who aren't as familiar with that form of direct democracy. 26 states and district have the ability to put ballot initiatives on. You've had great success with that in DC. So one, we want to hear about your success story, because I do feel like there's just been so much doom and gloom out there. We need to hear the success stories because they are inspiring to people who know that they can get involved in these things, they can make a difference. But like many things, we've seen that process can be manipulated. So we want to talk a little bit about not only ballot initiatives and the process itself, but kind of what we're seeing in terms of how people are trying to manipulate that process and what we can do about it.
Yes, in DC, we did have great success in 2024. Actually, it started out with me being selfish. I had left the Democratic Party, but didn't realize that I was disenfranchising myself. I lost the right to vote in primaries in DC. And I faced this moment of, well, do I rejoin the party or do I change the system? I decided I would change the system. So, and that was not an easy decision to make. And there were some other folks in DC who wanted to implement ranked choice voting in DC. Our primaries really are the only game in town, and only a sliver of voters come out for primaries in DC, just like every place else. So we were ending up with a council and a mayor who were elected in most cases by a minority of folks. And so we decided, let's bring both of these issues together. They're very powerful issues that put voters first. And let's take it to the people. Let the people vote. Let the people decide. And we won. 73%, which was incredible. And in a year, 2024, where there were 6 other similar ballot initiatives, we're the only ones who won. The process is not for the meek. If you are afraid of being challenged, don't do it. If you don't like to be called names, don't do it. If you take things too personally, don't do it. But if you can develop a tough outer shell, if you believe in what you're doing, if you have a good board of elections that is neutral, that's all you need is neutrality, and then do the hard work. And in DC, we won. Of course, winning is not the only thing. Then you need to get it funded, and I won't get into all of those specifics, but it's really amazing. It's an amazing process. And when you can say 73% of voters are behind this, it really becomes about we the people. Really, 73%. I mean, when's the last time 73% of people agreed on anything?
Those numbers are amazing. Can we give Lisa a little round of applause?
Thank you. And not every place, as you said, 26 states in the District of Columbia do support ballot initiative processes. I will say that when we gained subject matter approval, one of the members of our council was busy trying to thwart the process and trying to go behind, and sort of rewrite history. That didn't happen. But it is a really powerful tool, because then you have this success, and all you need is funding, like as if that's simple, but you just need the funding. And when you have that many people behind you and that many people excited, and when it is about changing how people vote, it is so critical that you just keep pushing. I don't know how I do it, but I love it. It's fun, and it's a challenge. And I will say that we are still up against political opposition. The DC State Democratic Committee still has us in court. But you know what? On June 16th, we will have our first primaries run with a ranked choice voting system.
All right, thank you. Well, speaking of court, we're going to go over to Amit. And I think one of the things about elections that a lot of people don't realize is there's this really complex set of statutes and regulations that govern elections, both at the federal and the individual state level. And we're seeing an increase in litigation over election-related topics in recent years. Can you talk a little bit about your background just working on some of these cases? I know you've worked on the Slaughter case in particular, just to give people some insights on how to navigate those complex statutes and regulations.
Yeah, sure. It's a big question, and it's kind of hard to answer with just at a really high level of generality, kind of about the entire universe of cases. I guess I would say with respect to the Slaughter case, my experience, the things that concern me in connection with that case are two aspects of the Trump administration's position in that case that pertain to the topic that we're talking about today. So the first is on the merits. The Trump administration's position is that the president has the right to fire the heads of independent agencies, including the heads of election-related agencies like the Federal Election Commission, like the Election Administration Commission, that he has the right to fire them, not just if they do something wrong. Because I think the vast majority of people would say, look, if they're doing something wrong, and if maybe even a reasonable person could say that they're doing something wrong, maybe the president should have the authority to fire them, and that's fine. The authority that is being asserted is the authority to fire them for a bad reason, or for no reason at all, because of their race, because of their sex, because of their party affiliation, because they refuse to do something illegal, because they refuse to investigate one of the president's political opponents. And I don't know anyone who thinks that that is a good idea as a matter of social policy to have something as important as election administration, that almost everyone would say that should be nonpartisan, that you should be able to fire someone because they are not taking action that is not in the best interest of the country and instead is just motivated by partisan political animus or something like that. So that is an aspect of the administration's position on the merits issue in Slaughter that is of concern to me and that I think should be of concern to all Americans. There's another aspect of the Slaughter case that doesn't really get that much attention, but also has implications for rule of law and for some of the subjects that we're talking about today. And that is their position on the remedial issue of what do you do? What happens? What can a court do if the president takes action, in that case firing the head of an independent agency, that is illegal, that is in contravention of a statute that's enacted by Congress and is upheld by the courts? And the administration's position is the federal courts are completely powerless to offer any kind of meaningful remedy if the president illegally fires the head, say, for example, of the Federal Election Commission or the Election Administration Commission in violation of a valid federal law. And think about that for a second, that there is nothing that any court anywhere at any time can do to remedy what would be, in that hypothetical, a conceded violation of federal law. And that strikes me as an altogether untenable position, and again, something that should be of concern to all Americans, because it goes to kind of not just the specific issue in that case, but more broadly, what is our commitment to the rule of law? What is our commitment to the idea that there should be constraints on the exercise of power? What is our commitment to the idea that when we have good faith, honorable disagreements about what the facts are or what the law are, that we have this impartial judiciary that we can turn to, and when they come to a judgment, then that judgment needs to be honored and respected, and it'll be implemented by the executive branch. So I guess those are things that, in connection with my work on the Slaughter case, have been very much on my mind, and I hope that starts to answer the really important question that you asked.
It does, thank you. And one of the things that's great about the Principles First Summit is that we have so many attendees who are really engaged, that want to be involved. And I think whether we're talking about elections, rule of law, any of the topics that we've been able to cover here this weekend, the number one question that we hear from our members is, what can I do? So I think that we just want to touch base with each of you on that important question. If somebody is concerned about election integrity, election security, what are tangible steps that people can do to get involved, to stay involved, and to ensure that, particularly with the concerns relating to the midterm election coming up in November, that things are following the proper process, that they are lawful, and ultimately that they are fair?
Okay, I'll kick it off. I think it's really important right now because what we're seeing is unprecedented attacks on the guardrails of our elections. But that being said, we don't want to scare people so much that they end up becoming disillusioned. I've seen that happen in other countries where there's maybe an authoritarian pressure or backsliding, and people say, like, you know, I'm done, I'm out. We don't want that, right? We want to make sure that there's positive messaging for people to get engaged. So I would say at the individual level and at the organizational level, there's different things. At the individual level, we and our colleagues can all get out and become poll workers. We can engage in the process. We can volunteer to be election observers. We can be election judges, right? You can get involved in the process. We also, a lot of us are community leaders. And to demonstrate in your community, whether that's as a faith leader or a veterans leader or whatever group you're engaged in, to demonstrate to people like, look, the process works. Elections work. Like, let's get involved. Let's see how this works and understand that we can trust the process. I think a third thing that Issue 1 we're going to be working with, and I know a lot of other organizations are doing, is to get people mobilized to take action, to tell their politicians we don't want to see fair elections tilted. We don't want to see our free and fair elections meddled with. And to do that in advance so that the decision makers, whether they be governors, members of Congress, secretaries of state, or other people who might be able to enable manipulation or enable federal troops to come into to a state around elections or other things, they know in advance the cost of doing that will be quite high with their voters. And we need to deter that behavior. We can't wait until it happens. So we want to mobilize people to start demonstrating that with calls and letters and everything else to say, like, we want to protect fair elections. We don't want ICE agents in our polls or other things. At the organizational level, I would say, keeping our eye on the ball, keeping our eye on what's important, and really working together. Lessons abroad, again, I'll draw from. Cross-sectoral efforts, collaboration across civil society groups, whether that be, like I said, the business communities, veterans communities, faith communities, and pro-democracy communities need to work together across sectors to ensure that there's protection for if things do go south, everybody is on the same page, that we're not going to stand for this. And then I think another crucial thing is we all have to get much better at helping our constituents connect elections to their everyday lives. Why do elections matter to them? They matter because it's the only way they can hold their elected leaders accountable. The quality of your roads, the quality of your schools, the quality of your health care, your rights, your freedoms, all depend on you being engaged in this process and actively beyond voting. So I think that's something we've sort of had a shortcoming on over the past several years, and we really need to focus on that right now and get people engaged to protect our free and fair elections.
Lisa, what's your advice for people who want to know what they can do?
Yeah, first and foremost, vote. Vote, make a plan, vote in primaries, so important. And tell people about your plan. Tell 5 people about your plan. Get involved in voter education. That's the second thing I would say. Probably where you live, there's a League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is phenomenal with voter education. So contact your local League of Women Voters. Ask them when they will have their next education series. Tell them you want to help. They need volunteers, and they register people to vote. It is so, so important to get people excited about voting. And then I want to echo what you said. Volunteer yourself to become a poll worker. The Board of Elections in your local area is looking for volunteers. I know in DC, you can go to the Board of Elections site, and there's some place right there. You click down, you volunteer, and you get to meet some of your neighbors. And it's a very exciting day for a lot of people. And I will tell you, what is most exciting is when you see people who are voting for the first time, and they're like, I'm a first-time voter. Yes, awesome, welcome. And I also love it when people bring their kids. My parents brought me to the polls. So you can be involved with your community. Again, very important. And please, please vote in primaries. It's so important.
As a mom, I just want to say I love that last point that you made. I do bring my kid with me when I go vote, so that is important. It's all about the next generation, right?
Yes.
Amit, what advice do you have for people who are curious about what they can do to preserve election integrity?
So I am fortunate to work for an organization called Protect Democracy, and we get that question all the time. And so what I will direct you to is go onto our website, look under the news and updates section of our homepage, and you will find there a document that identifies no fewer than 29 concrete steps that ordinary citizens can take to get involved in their communities and to be a part of this grand pro-democracy fight. So there's a lot of guidance out there. There's a lot of energy that I feel out there right now. People are worked up and they want to fight for our democracy and for the rule of law. And every single one of us has things that we can do. You can be a lawyer, you don't have to be a lawyer. You can go to your local polling place and be a nonpartisan worker. You can engage your neighbor in conversation just to deal with that information ecosystem problem we were talking about earlier, about just trying to come up with shared facts so that this disinformation that is spread and that has such a corrosive effect on our democracy, so that you deal with that at the ground level before it festers into the kind of problem that, as was mentioned, sometimes it gets too late to talk about. So I guess first I'd say, look at those 29 steps. I think there's some good advice and some options there for getting involved. I do want to follow up, if I may, for a second, on something that was said about the attitude and the mindset that we need at this point in time, and that really resonates with me. A couple of things resonate. First, the thing that resonates most is what you said about it being fun. It is fun. You know, a lot of people are demoralized these days. I don't feel demoralized at all. I feel energized, and I feel like it is so much fun to be a small part of this pro-democracy movement and do it because it's the right thing to do, but also do it because it's fun and it's immensely satisfying. The other thing I would say is I think the attitudinal challenge that we face in dealing with this current predicament is striking the right balance between two different things. One is apprehending the nature of the threat, and at the same time to do that in a way that doesn't leave you demoralized. And so the way I like to describe it sometimes is, sometimes people ask me, what is your assessment of the threat level on a scale of 1 to 10? And I say candidly, I'm at a 10. Like, I think it's that bad. But that doesn't mean that we can't win this fight. That doesn't mean that there's anything inevitable about a decline into authoritarianism. It just means that we need to wake up and open our eyes to unpleasant realities about what's happening around us. But can we win this fight? Absolutely. We all have the tools at our disposal to vindicate rule of law principles that have been around for centuries and that have made this democracy work. There's a quote from a great Churchill speech that really sort of speaks to me and that I think speaks to our time, and that is, there was a speech in which he said something like, a preponderance of power is on our side. It has but to be combined to be obeyed. And I think that was true of Europe in the 1930s. It's true in the United States today for the pro-democracy movement. There is absolutely a substantial majority of the American people who believe that we should have free and fair elections, that if the Supreme Court of the United States comes out with a decision issued in good faith, that the President of the United States should respect and honor and follow that decision. There's a substantial majority of the American people who believe that. We just need to put aside things that don't matter, put aside partisan commitments and subordinate them to our overarching commitment to principles of American democracy and the rule of law. And that's an absolutely winnable fight.
Thank you. All right, we are starting to run out of time. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 quick questions from the audience.
How you guys doing? My name is Josh Roltenberg. Just for full transparency, I'm the co-author with Rory's upcoming book about ending partisan gerrymandering.
Who let you in here?
Obviously, this is a topic that has been going on for hundreds of years in this country. And so while I agree the administering of elections come early voting, come election day is safe and secure, before you ever get to that point, a lot of this is in the hands of politicians. So why should people trust the systems that are in place if politicians still have access to draw these maps?
Do you want to jump in?
I could jump in for a little bit on that and totally agree. Partisan gerrymandering is one of the deepest structural problems with our elections. Like we said, I mean, I think it's something like almost 90% of our congressional races are non-competitive. And the result of this is that politicians are picking their voters. The voters are not picking their elected officials. And that gets to the heart of the issue. In addition to that, the polarization that's caused by this is tremendous. So that's why we have gridlock in Congress. That's why our partisan politics are such, at such polarized ends. Now, the solution is difficult, as we've known, right? State-level initiatives, there's a lot of promising ones. You all are writing about it. The courts have said, essentially, Supreme Court says we're not getting involved. We can't get involved in partisan gerrymandering. So what's left? Congress. Congress is left. There are 3 things Congress could do to end gerrymandering and to allow us to have better, fair representation. 1, they can ban mid-decade gerrymandering, unless by a court order. Everybody should agree on that. There should not be mid-decade gerrymandering.
Evan Kiley is really happy to hear you say that.
Yeah, a couple of people who are getting gerrymandered out, and on the Democrats and Republican sides have introduced bills, so bring them together and get it passed. Second, just basic standards for redistricting at the federal level. With a couple of key standards, we could improve the way redistricting is done. And then third, requiring independent redistricting commissions like we see in 11 states. If that was done at the federal level, you don't have one bad apple like a Texas or anybody else who can decide to start mid-decade gerrymandering, and then that triggers everybody else to get rid of their commissions. So we need a federal requirement for independent redistricting. And we've seen in those states that have done it, there's a better, fairer representation, voters trust the elections more. So let's get those three things done at the congressional level.
Yeah, you know, systemically, independent redistricting is what we need. At an individual level, if you're wondering why I said vote in primaries, this is why. In 2022, 88% of House seats were safe, and only 8% of voters voted in the primaries. And this is why we have the Congress that we have. And so I don't want people to feel that you don't individually have power. You have power. You need to get involved. You need to learn who's running in the primaries, and you need to vote in the primaries.
Do you want to have the last word?
A couple of ideas that are out there. I guess one is Protect Democracy has been working on proposed legislation that's being introduced into state legislatures that would provide for state laws that provide mechanisms for vindicating federal constitutional rights. And the model legislation is called the UCRA, so I would look into that because I think that's a really good option when the federal government is not doing its job of enforcing federal rights. Another proposal that I think is worth looking at is fusion voting. That's, again, something that my colleagues at Protect Democracy have done a great job working on. And that's basically the idea that you should have a candidate, the same candidate, who could be, who could be nominated by multiple parties. But it's a way of kind of moderating political discourse and allowing people to support the candidate that they want, and at the same time to support moderation within political parties.
All right. Thank you very much to our panel.